Can I get the icon in cornflower blue?
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 11 of Can I Get That Software in Blue? I'm one of your hosts, Chad Tindel, and along with me is my esteemed co-host, Steve Mayzak.
Hey Chad, I love your sweater.
Yeah, we're doing a ugly sweater episode, so those of you who are listening on audio, you may want to consider switching to the YouTube video here. I'm going to show you mine. This is December 31st when we were recording. Season 4 of Cobra Kai just dropped, and so I'm representing in my Cobra Kai hoodie. Steve, what are you rocking?
Well, I decided to build one this year, and I put all these gnomes because my wife loves these gnomes. So I put gnomes and I pin them on my sweater.
Are they Christmas gnomes or are they underpants gnomes?
They're Christmas gnomes. They all have little beards and mustaches or whatever.
That's awesome.
Drinking my water and getting little pieces of mustache hair in my water. But, yeah.
Do they like jingle when you walk around? Is there bells on them?
No, next year I'll upgrade. Like, it's planned obsolescence here. We gotta.
Oh, it's a work in progress. I love it. Rhett, what are you rocking there? That's a Pendleton, right?
This is my Lebowski sweater. Sorry, I can't do an ugly sweater. I have to do a beautiful sweater.
Well, it's we'll allow it. We will allow it. And Forrest, what do you got?
I've got the ramen noodle soup, chicken edition.
Do you also have the beef and shrimp shirts to go with the ramen?
It's a search that's in progress. I got to find the full set.
All right, if I find the beef one, I'll let you know.
Sounds good. Give me a call.
All right. Well, today we're going to be doing an episode focused on Web3 concepts and technology. So we're having our first bestie guestie host, Rhett Garber, is joining us today. Rhett is a strong developer who was an early engineer and engineering manager at several successful startups. First at Yelp, where he built out the engineering team and took it through an IPO. Then at Postmates, which of course was later acquired by Uber. And then now at GitHub, which was recently acquired by Microsoft. So basically everything Rhett touches and works on turns to gold. Today he's going to be bringing the developer's perspective to this Web3 discussion. So Rhett, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome, Rhett.
He didn't have anything else to do since the streets of Seattle are sheets of ice and he can't go anywhere. So he's just working and joining us as well. And then we're excited to be joined today by our special guest, Forrest Colyer. He's a blockchain specialist solution architect at AWS, helping customers across multiple industries with private blockchain solutions. He also runs a very popular YouTube channel covering crypto topics with, 150,000 subscribers or something like that. So we're very lucky to have him joining us today to discuss Web3 technologies. Forrest, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Forrest is going to do some demos for us later. So again, that's one more reason you might want to watch this episode on YouTube if you can. If not, we'll do our best to describe what we're seeing. So let's just dive right in. We're going to start, although the topic of this show is Web3, we're going to spend a few minutes just defining some terms so that anybody who hasn't heard these terms will understand what we're talking about before we dive off into the deep end. So I'm just going to throw some terms at Forrest, and he's going to give us a quick lightning round of definitions for us. So let's just start with blockchain. Tell us what a blockchain is.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty brilliant place to start. So, I mean, if you really peel everything back, a blockchain's a form of distributed ledger technology, and it really provides an immutable, or to be more accurate, like a tamper-evident record of state data and all historical transactions that have modified that state in this network. So the immutable nature of this is basically built from the fact that a blockchain can only be appended to. New transactions can append new additions to state, not delete or modify something in history. And it's really mechanically, or if you think about the topology, multiple distributed nodes, clients that run the same software that keep an independent copy of the ledger and agree to the state on a given cadence. And that cadence is basically defined in a consensus algorithm. And so why it's called a blockchain, you have consensus processes happening between these distributed nodes, agreeing to the state of that ledger. And each of those sort of state changes or modifications happen in the context of blocks. And those blocks are filled with transactions. So you have those chained to each other. So you have a chain of blocks or a blockchain.
You know, we had a previous episode with Kunal Anand was on talking to us about the difference between like proof of work versus proof of stake and things like that with different blockchains. But there's so many blockchains out there now, not just Bitcoin and Ethereum, Solana, Cardano, Algorand, Hedera, hundreds of them. Is there what really is the difference between these things other than the proof of work versus proof of stake concepts?
I mean, now there are a lot of different designs and things that go into these different blockchains, but they're all trying to accomplish sort of the same thing. And they're trying to balance the blockchain trilemma, which is achieving decentralization, security, and scalability. And traditionally, the idea is that you can really only achieve two. You got to trade off on one. So all these different blockchain protocols are being designed to balance those things in the best way possible to at best accomplish all three at the same time, which I would argue has not yet happened. It differs in consensus algorithm, but also the underlying technologies and protocols down to like how peer-to-peer communications happen, how data is stored, what execution environments are built atop that to enable like application functionality on that blockchain. So lots of things.
All right. Well, if I was going to take my life savings and YOLO it into one coin, which one do you recommend?
Oh man. Now that is a question. This is just kind of going to show my own bias, but I sort of came up in this space building things in the Ethereum space. So I still think Ethereum is one of those ones that's going to be around for a long time. We've got a whole generational upgrade to the Ethereum network, acknowledging that it has flaws, hopefully, and I believe that those flaws will be fixed in the coming years. And we'll see Ethereum still being a major place where future financial services are run.
It'll be the Craigslist of the crypto world. Like, it's ugly, but it works, basically.
The thing that will just never die. Well, I hope that it's upgraded more often than Craigslist, but we'll stick with that. Yeah.
Well, Ethereum just went through a major upgrade, didn't they?
There have been some significant upgrades. I mean, a lot of them have been sort of tweaks and economic focused upgrades, changes to like the token economics around Ethereum, the fee market. But there's a generational upgrade coming, a move from proof of work to proof of stake, sort of a formal cutover, if you will, a merge, as they're really calling it. And that's going to be when the real deal changes start to happen.
Is this what's called Ethereum 2?
Yeah, Ethereum 2, that's really the transition. Right now, you kind of have two Ethereum networks. Technically, you've got Ethereum 2.0, the beacon chain that runs proof of stake. And it's just basically running and agreeing on like, empty blocks, basically. So it's running in shadow mode. And you have the Ethereum network today, the proof of work network, which we now call Ethereum 1.0. It's still running. Everyone's doing their thing on there and running applications, and the cryptocurrency world's thriving there. Eventually, that's going to merge Ethereum 1 to Ethereum 2. It's going to take on the consensus proof of stake algorithm from the Ethereum 2 network and keep the smart contract execution and all the good stuff we have from Ethereum 1. So there's a merge hopefully happening in 2022.
Well, that's a good segue to the next term. So talk to us about what smart contracts and gas are.
Yeah, I was trying to tee that up for you. So
good job. You're a good guest.
Yeah, so smart contracts. This is one of those things where I think the nomenclature lets people down a lot. So smart contracts, really, in the simplest form, are pieces of code or applications that can be executed in the context of a blockchain. And when I say in the context of a blockchain, meaning the execution of that code is facilitated by this distributed network. So you also have sort of this distributed computing environment in and of itself as well.
So the same nodes that are running the consensus algorithm will execute the code of these smart contracts or remote functions.
Right, exactly. And effectively, when you're deploying this code out there as a smart contract, let's take Ethereum, for example, you're effectively open sourcing that code, right? You're putting it out there and you have a set of instructions. The language in Ethereum that's now popular in other places as well is called Solidity. I would say it's kind of C-like and JavaScript-like. It's kind of a wild language in terms of how hard it is to master, but it's very easy to get started with. But with Solidity, it basically compiles down to bytecode instructions for the Ethereum virtual machine to facilitate on the network. And that facilitates sort of state mutations and all sorts of other things in that space. And those things all happen via transactions the same way you would send a cryptocurrency token from one person to another. So smart contracts are really the crux of blockchains as application layers, or blockchains as functional applications.
You mentioned open sourcing the code. If I look on a blockchain and actually inspect the record where this smart contract exists, do I see the bytecode or do I see the source code as well? Or how do I verify that the source code that I look at is the actual compiled bytecode of that function?
Yeah, so what you're going to see is I mean, it depends on how, like what data you're accessing, right? There are different degrees of data access, like archive nodes, for example, that keep a really deep copy of the ledger, you're going to have more information throughout history than another type of node, like a full node, quote unquote. So that is really what it depends on. But you're going to get the instruction level stuff, the really ugly sort of bytecode level stuff, the instructions. If you wanted to go and verify, though, there are binary interfaces, and so like the ABI and bytecode, which will allow you to verify the smart contract that you're using matches up to a piece of source code that you can compile on your own. And so if you go on like block explorers like Etherscan, you'll often see like popular smart contracts. They've got the source code and the bytecode and the application binary interface kind of all there, so you can easily verify what's going on. There are various different ways that you can go about doing that with programmatic methods or also explorers where you can kind of visually see it.
Are they kind of decompiling the bytecode and showing you source code, or how? I guess how, is there no way for someone to cheat this where they show here's my smart function, but there's actually like this loophole in the compiled version?
There's no way to take a piece of like a smart contract, right, written in Solidity, give that to someone and say, here it is on chain, and just trust me, it's the same, because I can take that uncompiled Solidity, compile it down, I could deploy it, and I could very easily see that the bytecode and the ABI, which basically defines all of the functionality of that contract, the inputs, the outputs, etc., I could verify very quickly that those are not the same, right?
Got it.
Very, very quickly. And that's one of the keys there, is to allow people to do that.
That's not going to work at scale. Like, not everyone's going to take apart the source code and verify that it's valid, right?
Yeah. And that's where there's going to always have to be some degree of trust that you take in the abstractions that average users use to interact with these things. Definitely.
Yeah. And when it comes to money, we all know trust is fleeting, right? That's why we have things like the SEC. So who's going to referee all this stuff?
Yeah, well, the refereeing is one of those things that's a very complex topic, and I'm sure we're going to get into that more as we talk about like the ethos of Web3 compared to Web 2 and Web 1 and all that sort of stuff. But the refereeing is evolving rapidly. It's how do you dictate that trust? How do you put the power in an individual's hands to verify things on their own and sort of train people to think that way? Because a lot of people don't even think about that now. That's why phishing sites are so prevalent. So I'm not going to say that just having this technology solves those problems. It really doesn't. They're going to have to be a combination of community run initiatives, I would say, and also potentially, most likely, governmental agencies as well that help bridge this gap, because it's the Wild West still, for sure.
Why didn't they make it so that you actually just submit the source code and the virtual machine compiles it to bytecode for you, so that they're side by side in the blockchain?
Yeah, frankly, I actually couldn't tell you exactly why that is. I don't know what the design decision is there. I will say that there's so many different types of smart contract execution environments now, and how in different ways and how they work. I mean, you have ones where you do just sort of pass the code in and it runs in a sort of trusted execution environment type of space, right? And that code is running in its own runtime. I mean, there are lots of different methodologies now. The first implementation or the first instance of smart contracts in general were these Ethereum virtual machine or EVM style ones, where there really weren't a lot of tools back then to work with these things. And so you would be basically stuck with very rudimentary, lower level tools to work with. Now it's gotten a lot better. You have IDEs and other things that really help. This whole space around smart contracts is still evolving. I don't think we're at the end state by any means whatsoever.
All right, tell us about gas. What is gas, other than the stuff my wife hates?
Well, isn't that gear acquisition syndrome? That's what I have.
Yeah, no, I suffer from the same. So gas in the context of blockchains and smart contracts, I think, are best described with an understanding of how the computation environment works. So when Ethereum, for example, first came into the mix, it was described as sort of a world computer. And I think since the team has sort of moved away, the community has moved away from that descriptor. But I think it's a great way to describe what gas is. If you think about the fact that you are replacing what was traditionally is a centralized sort of client-server relationship, where I, as a client, am interacting with a server owned by a company where they have an application running, right? And they do all that stuff, maybe in an opaque way. it's all done, right? It's all done for me. In this space, you're now taking that model and you're breaking it up. You have this decentralized, distributed model where everything is peer-to-peer. And I, as a client, could also potentially run a node where I am effectively a server as well. In this environment, all these different nodes in the network are effectively contributing their compute resources to executing that code, verifying and validating transactions on the network if you're participating in consensus, storing a copy of that ledger, right? So there's resource expenditure for members of this network. And so as a result, you need people who want their transactions validated, who want their code executed as a response to those transactions, and maybe state to be stored. They need to pay their way. And so gas is sort of a fee utility to pay for the resources that are consumed by various operations or opcodes executed by that code. That could be storing a piece of data, that could be computing and then storing a variable, all sorts of things like that. So gas is the fee utility that pays for your compute resources used in the network.
So it's kind of like the cost of invoking a Lambda function or something like that.
Pretty much.
So uploading my fork bomb, you're saying, is going to be very expensive.
Is uploading it expensive or is executing it expensive?
The most expensive thing is storage. So if you're trying to store a large string, you're going to pay hefty prices for that.
Why is that when storage is like the cheapest thing I can buy in the market for computing power resources?
In this peer-to-peer network where, in a sense, there's finite space, if each node on the network needs to store a copy of this ledger in the state they're in, even if they're storing just sort of and I'm simplifying here, but like a minified copy.
Yeah.
You want to mitigate instances where people are going to be willy-nilly just storing a ton of data there. So it's sort of a check in there saying, don't store things you don't have to store because everyone's got to store this. And so that's kind of what it's there for, is to put an economic disincentive for people to abuse the network in that way and store extra stuff.
This probably helps explain why the smart contracts are stored as bytecode and not as the original string interpretation.
I would bet that that's why.
That makes more sense now. All right, hold on. Let me share my screen really quick. Talk to us about DeFi and NFTs. I know that NFTs became part of the popular consciousness here. This news article I'm showing, Beeple sold an NFT for $69 million earlier this year. That's when most people probably first heard the term NFT. And since then, it's really blown up. Ubisoft is using NFTs for in-game items. And the NFL has launched their own NFT marketplace called NFL All Day. Even winemakers like Mondavi is releasing wine bottles using NFTs so that I guess they can prevent wine counterfeiting and things like that. So tell us what an NFT really is.
Yeah, an NFT stands for non-fungible token. And one of the things prerequisite to understanding what an NFT is understanding the concept of fungibility. So fungibility basically refers to the ability to exchange an asset of like kind one-to-one. So a fungible asset would be something like a US dollar. Chad, I could hand you a $1 bill. You could hand me one back. I don't care which dollar I have, which dollar bill I have. They're both worth $1, right? Doesn't matter.
And Bitcoin and Bitcoins is also fungible, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I don't care what specific Bitcoin unit I have. One Bitcoin is worth one Bitcoin. The opposite, though, is a non-fungible token would be something like a baseball card or a Pokemon card, where all of these cards are Pokemon cards, but each of them have different attributes, different rarities. They might be holographic. They might have different abilities in the actual game that make them more or less valuable than another. So I can't necessarily say I'm going to trade you one card for another until I know what attributes they are. They each have different value.
Specifically, we'd be talking about a one-of-a-kind baseball card or a one-of-a-kind Pokemon card, right? Where there literally is no equivalent that you could trade me for that would be the same.
Yeah, and the whole one-of-one idea has now been extended to, collections as well. So you'll have like NFTs that represent true one-of-a-kind assets, a piece of art. But then, if in the fine art space, now you have a lot of people creating, maybe 10 of a piece and saying there are 10 of these. It's not necessarily just one. There's 10. It's in a collection. So it's a way to establish, though, a digital collectible, if you will, whether one of one or as part of a collection. That's where that Beeple piece came from, is the first example, to my knowledge, of this, insanely highly valued piece of digital art.
It's interesting. It feels like for the art world, at least,
Mhm.
art will become more and more like music. Whereas when I first got into music, I would go to the store and either buy records or tapes and then CDs. Eventually, I downloaded from Napster because I could get just the one song that I wanted.
Mhm.
And then eventually I just subscribed to Spotify. Where, so like in the early days, there were limited numbers of copies of that music. But now with NFTs, like just as an artist would paint something, if they're doing something digital, they can recreate it as much as they want. And if it's all digital, why wouldn't the art world take advantage of NFTs or something like that to go towards this subscription world where I just subscribe and I get, a network of artists that I can display on my frame TV or whatever it is, right?
There is a degree of commoditization that can come of things like this. Like you mentioned the transition of music as a physical medium to a predominantly digital medium. I think that there will be a little bit of both. I think there will be the commoditization, but there will also sort of maintain this scarcity that's a little bit more provable, right? It'd be very easy for me to prove now that I am the sole owner of this Beeple piece because I have a public record that's cryptographically signed that says Beeple minted or created this NFT of which I am the sole owner, and I can track that back in an instant. Of course, people argue then, well, if the art is digital, there's no brush strokes. It's not real art. Right click save. And I think you really have to come down to the point where everyone has their own subjective view of what makes something valuable, what makes art valuable. Is it the fact that it's physical and someone touched it, or is it just the creation and proving that you own the one of one, the original? Whether that's digital or physical, the certificate of ownership for the original, I think, is still worth something to a lot of people.
Yeah, but I think that's a luxury, and I think that a lot of people is a small number, honestly. Like, I don't really care if I don't have the original piece of artwork that Beeple sold. If I have a screenshot of it because the person that owns it published a screenshot, then I can just as easily take that digital representation or copy of another digital asset and just display it wherever I want. Of course, this is for artwork or baseball cards or something like that. But I do feel like what we've shown as a species is that as we digitize things, they become inherently almost less valuable
Yeah, I would agree with that.
because now they're just rubber stamp, right? We can just create more. There is no cost to having a million copies of an MP3 from Taylor Swift. You know what I mean?
Have you been looking at my music collection again, Steve?
Always, Chad, always.
Yes, 1,000 copies of the same T Swift song.
I can't get enough.
Don't blame you. I mean, if you look at where NFTs are really, I think, trending, though, it's looking at things like in-game items, things like fractionalizing ownership of a piece of content that's consumed digitally,
Yep.
Extrapolating what really makes them unique. And I think digital art, of course, is something that a lot of people reference now because there's lots of money being shifted around in this digital art space. Maybe, and Steve, I agree with a lot of your assertions that over time, the commoditization of digital art could eventually make it so that there's very limited market for the one of one Beeple piece.
Like in the collector space, I remember when I was growing up, I was told the lie of, buy comic books, they'll be worth money one day, or collect all these baseball cards because they'll be worth money one day. And
Yeah.
I did that. I bought baseball cards, football cards, comic books. A couple years ago, I got rid of all my comic books because of all of them. I had 2 shoe boxes of the ones I thought would be worth money. Maybe I'm a bad judge, which is also possible. But the one that I had that was worth the most was like a Silver Surfer comic, and it was worth like $7. So I was like, no one wants this Silver Surfer comic. I'm just going to sell them all at the garage sale. Some of that is like translating here. It's just how does that work in the digital space for people that collect things, and what's that going to look like? Because I totally agree in the digital art or digital asset thing. Like if I wanted to buy something in a game, it totally makes sense to me. It's my thing, and I can resell that thing because there's maybe only one unless someone hacked it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But why do you need an NFT to do that? Why can't you just do that in the game economy? Are NFTs going to be used for anything other than collectibles?
NFTs also, I believe personally, can be a vehicle for proving and attesting to identity attributes as well, issuing what is effectively a digital proof. Because I mean, your identity attributes are assets that right now we don't really own at all, right? We're issued these things, and these identity attributes are verified and pretty much owned by government agencies or third-party companies, what have you. have a feeling that NFTs in some form or fashion will end up being part of our identity space as well. But if you think about NFTs and why they're important for the digital asset space, like for an in-game item, if you look at something like Fortnite, popular game right now, people are spending billions of dollars on these in-game skins and things through their account, and they're checking the terms and conditions box without reading it. And that terms and conditions box basically says that at any given time, the company behind these games can take those items away from you. They can change their mind. They can close your account, and all the money you spent, they get to keep, but you don't have anything to show for it. And I think this space, if you have a wallet, which is composed of a private key and subsequent addresses, you have now a non-revocable title of ownership to those digital items. Even if that game company decides they don't want you to have it, they can't really do anything about that. So it's giving you ownership.
But couldn't they just delete the item from the game?
No, Chad, they'll just come out with the next version of the game. Call of Duty next year, Call of Duty the year after, right?
Well, either way, I mean, they could delete the in-game item completely, right?
Well, that's the other thing, is where then you start to think about the incentive structure. When you give a player ownership of an item and you create a secondary market, as a game developer, I'm starting to think, well, how can I monetize this and how can I make this work for me? Arguably, I think there's a great alignment of incentives there between the player and the game studio in having this ownership dynamic, because you can create new game experiences that depend on items that are not mapped to one single game. You can have a family of games, Call of Duty 1 to Call of Duty 4 might be using items from your collection of Call of Duty ecosystem items. Secondary market sales and user generated content, game developers get a cut, right? They get 1% on those transactions. So now you're milking a lot more longevity out of a single game and breaking out of this $60 per game title, and then everything you've done in the past goes away every year.
So the smart contract that governs the rules of the NFT can basically say that the creator of the object, let's say the artist who made that piece of art or what have you, will get a cut of every future sale, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, an NFT is really a very simple data structure in a smart contract. If you think about it, you're really mapping an address, which is basically, in a simple terms, a hash of a public key for a given user's wallet, right? You've got your private key, public key, and then a hashed address. You're mapping an address to a UUID, basically. And that UUID has associated content, whatever that might be. That's really what an NFT is in very simple terms. And you can program various functionalities atop that, and saying anytime someone, calls a transfer function on this NFT and moves from one address to the other, a percentage of that transaction, that sale price, goes to the deployer of that contract, which could be the game developer or some other address.
So bringing it back to the gas question, the NFT, by virtue of storage being very expensive, there is no image, the Beeple NFT does not have any image data associated with it. It is a URL, a hash to something else. Is that correct?
Yeah, you basically have a metadata, like a lot of, and I'm generalizing because there are a lot of now different approaches, but generally you have the NFT point to a URL where the content lives. So then there's the debate of, how do you durably store content? How do you guarantee that someone is not going to change content? To me, this is an issue of maturity, not an issue of mechanics. I really think that right now there's not been a solution for that side of it, storing larger files and storing content in that same direction. But there are some options now, distributed or decentralized file storage protocols like IPFS, which I'm a fan of, economic models on top of that for something like Filecoin, lots of cool things there. So I think that's really the future, is the content and the certificate of ownership and the NFT need to live on a peer-to-peer decentralized network, or there will be problems long term. And there already have been with pieces of content going missing.
Is there a standard for where that content lives, or is that NFT specific? It could be anything.
Yeah, I wouldn't say there's a formal standard. I would say there are sort of socially enforced standards. If you're just like throwing it up on your own personal server and saying, hey, trust me, it'll be here when you come back, that's going to be frowned upon. I think you see a mix of things. You'll see people running them on centrally hosted S3 CloudFront, sort of like CDN models, and that applies to other clouds as well. You'll also see a lot of people doing IPFS, interplanetary file system. I think that would probably be what the standard is, because it's at least a decentralized distributed network. There are some issues with availability there to a certain extent. I think that's becoming the standard. It's IPFS.
Forrest, do you think that there's going to be industry specific kind of blockchains for things like NFTs where, like, let's say the art industry? I just listened to a podcast the other day about the art industry and how there's a challenge between, the artist and the buyer or the collector, where the artist only makes money the first time they sell. And then every time after that, they make nothing, right? So if I'm buying a digital asset, I feel like there's not a lot of people in the world that are going to stand up these trusted networks and a trusted kind of you store it place where I store all my digital goods, like the Dropbox of Web3.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there's going to be like this need for kind of a you store it model where I buy storage space on some network, and then that's where I store my NFTs and all my other digital assets, and I pay some fee to keep that stuff there, just like I would do in the physical world?
I definitely do. And we're already seeing that, right? I mean, crypto exchanges already are acting in that sort of way for fungibles. They're kind of becoming banks where they're storing assets on behalf of you in custody, because a lot of people don't want to be responsible for their private key, which is the key to the castle.
That's exactly why I use Coinbase. Like, I really don't want my own wallet because I don't want to be one of those stories where I lost this thing and it's now worth millions of dollars.
I think that the Web3 space has become very alienating to people who just don't share these people's desire to hold one's own private key. Frankly, as someone who does it, it's not easy enough, and it's not foolproof enough for people to want to do it that are not going to dedicate their life to understanding everything about the space.
Right.
So I get why. But yes, I completely agree. There will be platforms that are focused exclusively on storing NFTs on behalf of holders and customers.
Yeah. One of the judges I use for technology and user experience is my wife and daughter. And like, if they don't understand it and they can't use it, then to me, it's not ready for mass market yet. It'll still be in the era or in the ecosystem of the techies, right? And until we can break out and they actually see some benefit, will it really break into the mainstream, I think.
Yeah. And I might be unpopular for saying this amongst my own colleagues in the, the Web3 space, but I don't even think we're at the point where it's mature enough for some techie people.
Yeah.
Like, I think there are technical people who are falling into the same traps that have happened for the last 5-6 years still. And so the user experience and the ease of use and the productization of this stuff is not quite there yet. And it'll take some time for that to happen.
So tell us about the difference between centralized and decentralized exchanges, because that's an important concept here too, right?
Yeah. And so, Chad, you mentioned DeFi earlier, and I know we went down the NFT rabbit hole, which is very easy to do. Decentralized exchanges, or DEXs, as they're called colloquially, are sort of a part of that decentralized finance ecosystem, which is basically taking centralized entities like exchanges that allow you to trade one asset for another, or banks who offer lending products where you give them your assets, they lend them out to institutions, and they give you yield in return. All of these different financial services are now being flipped to replace the centralized entity with a smart contract or a suite of smart contracts that facilitates, market making or lending processes around like collateralization, the issuance of fiat currency pegged assets called stable coins. There's all sorts of things coming out of this space. And so if you compare the centralized exchange to a decentralized exchange, it really comes down to a handful of things. First is custody. A decentralized exchange basically lets you, the person who wants to swap assets, hold your own cryptographic keys, own your own wallet, facilitate that exchange. You don't have to give your assets to a Coinbase or to a Kraken or to another centralized entity to hold for you and facilitate exchange. And instead of having an exchange or a centralized entity manage an order book or facilitate the function of being a market maker, you have a smart contract doing that algorithmically. The most common pattern for this now in a decentralized exchange where you are using smart contracts to facilitate swap of like one cryptocurrency for another is the automated market maker or AMM model, which is basically constant product liquidity pools. So you have liquidity providers who provide a pair of tokens or a pair of cryptocurrencies of equal value. And then that sort of pool of paired assets is used as liquidity for people swapping. So it's a pretty brilliant structure, to be honest with you. And now there are people trying to emulate order book exchanges with mapping buy and sell orders. Wild world, but it's basically replacing the function of a centralized exchange or market maker with automated systems.
Now, with Coinbase or Binance or any of these other centralized exchanges, I just go to their website and I interact with it like I would any other, Charles Schwab or something else. Mm-hmm. Is that how DEXs work, or do I need to somehow invoke smart functions using lower level APIs? Like, how would I actually interact with a DEX?
All DEXs have generally it's an open source team behind them. They've built the smart contracts, and they'll often build an interface which allow people to go to this interface, interact with it using a graphical UI and all the things, and abstract away a lot of the complexity.
But it's just an app running on my laptop, or is it a web? Do I talk to a server somewhere?
It's generally a web application. They're hosted in a variety of different ways. Sometimes they're hosted a very traditional way. You're serving static content, for example, or you might have like some host via IPFS as well. So it can say, hey, here is our interface. Right? Maybe it's a React application running and it's hosted via IPFS, right? So there's a plethora of different ways. The idea though is, and people always ask about this, it's like, well, if there's a user interface that's a point of centralization, right? If you're issuing that, you're hosting that as the team who's built this, that means this is kind of centralized, right? Ultimately, the one of the tenets of DeFi is that you have freedom of client, right? You can decide how you'd like to interact with it. The smart contracts will function the same way, regardless of whether you're using your own interface or you're using one supplied for you. And so you might have different teams who build abstractions on top of it. So now you have wallet applications on mobile and on desktop that have abstractions to interact with those smart contracts for decentralized exchanges directly. You might have third-party integrations you can interact with through there. So you do have options, but most of the time, DEXs offer their own interface you can use, so you don't have to understand the underlying smart contract functions and how they work, but you can if you want to.
So the smart contract and the blockchain that are acting as like the back end in the database and providing the API. And so anyone can write a front end application to interface with this API. Is that right?
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. And so like, again, earlier I was talking about like explorers, like block explorers, like Etherscan, for example, on Ethereum. If I know the smart contract address and I know generally how the DEX functions, and so I'll use one of the most popular ones on Ethereum called Uniswap. They started this whole automated market maker AMM model. If I know how those contracts work, I can go and find those contracts by their address, and I can go and I can see all the methods, and I can interact with them and populate transactions and do things myself, either programmatically or using the Block Explorer interface without using Uniswap's own front end. So there's some options for different types of users.
Or I could write my own.
Exactly. Yeah.
And because your invocation of that smart contract is publicly viewable, anybody can front run your trade, right?
Yeah. So there's front running is another interesting one. There's whole businesses now around like looking in the mempool, which is basically the queue of transactions on Ethereum, to try and anticipate the movement of markets via DEXs. It's not as easy to do, I think, as people might represent it is. First of all, not all nodes have all transactions underneath the hood. In a blockchain network, you have these really widely distributed nodes. Eventual consistency is prevalent here, right? Not every node's going to know about every transaction at a given time. As gossip protocols do their thing, more nodes start to hear about transactions, it becomes clearer. So it's not that easy to front run and guess and figure out what the market's going to do per se. But yeah, people try all the time.
I think we're underestimating the amount of money and time these people are willing to invest in this, right? Like if I can build something that aggregates all of the blockchains in a decentralized system and even have 1 second more of information than my nearest competitor, I'll pay millions for that, right? Like you look at the companies that put the servers on the New York Stock Exchange, they pay millions of dollars for every inch of cable that they, have for the network. So I think that's absolutely something that's going to have to be dealt with. And there's a lot of dangers there too. Like the people that are doing the investing could also be setting up and running their own network and basically be front running their own customers. You know what I mean? Just kind of like Robin Hood and the whole Tindel thing.
I think that really is going to come down to a fork in the road around what people's goals are and whether people actually buy into this idea where they're using non-centralized systems, where there's not a single monstrous monolithic entity that controls everything. Do you want to maybe sacrifice some degree of abstraction, take on a little bit more responsibility, but in return be able to interact with each other peer to peer and remove some of those central authorities and intermediaries, third parties, whatever you want to call them? I believe, and again, know the implicit bias because this is my career, right? And this is what I do. I do believe that there's appetite for the removal of these intermediaries, or maybe not full on removal, but a more balanced equation in terms of how much power these organizations have singularly in the systems and services that we use on a day-to-day basis. Maybe they'll still be part of it, but just not able to control everything single-handedly. Checks and balances, if you will.
I'm trying to become more suspicious of human beings because I'm a glass half full type person.
Yeah.
I'm very optimistic, so I'm usually blind to this kind of stuff, but I'm learning a lot more lately. Anyways, I was thinking like there has to be a conversation around incentives constantly around this stuff because the world you're describing sounds amazing, but who's going to run all these nodes on the network? What are my incentives to run the nodes? And, am I qualified? What happens if I don't have the proper backup strategies? And we're basically outsourcing the running of the internet to potentially a bunch of laymen.
Well, but your incentive to run the node is that you'll make money in gas fees every time someone invokes a function on your service, right?
How many people have the expertise to get that up and running, keep it maintained, keep it up to date, keep it secured? Like that is not an easy job to do. We know that. I mean, not a week goes by where there's not a data breach somewhere. And so now if you're telling me that to run a node on the decentralized blockchain network, anyone can do it, I don't think so.
Steve, you're right to the extent that trying to envision a world like that based on today is almost unbelievable. A lot of people struggle generationally setting up a home PC or getting a MacBook Pro and figuring it out for the first time. I think it's going to be two things that eventually will converge. It's going to be the clients that make up what a blockchain node is and how you participate, like what software you run and how you run it, what size or what level of capability your hardware needs, is going to start to converge with the general technical capacity of society, which from my perspective, I'm starting to see more people at least having a foundational understanding of these things. So it's going to be kind of like educationally, societally intersecting with the ease of use for the client itself and how you get set up. And I believe that will bridge the gap. It won't be something that everyone does, but I think there will be a sizable enough population of people capable of running a Raspberry Pi type of machine or on your smartphone, being able to run this network and just be part of a peer-to-peer network from a supercomputer in your hands. I think it's possible.
I want to understand the mechanics of how the front running would work. So if I want to do some sort of transaction in Ethereum, I go do this transaction and I bid a gas fee. And then if someone wants to front run my transaction because they think my move will, say, move the price of Ethereum up or something like that, they can just bid a higher gas fee and then they'll get slotted in the queue in front of me. Is that how that would work?
Yeah. I mean, a great example of this is in the NFT space. A lot of people in the NFT space, there's like a competition to mint NFTs because there's speculative value in these things. And so when there's a new collection that comes out, people really want it. You'll have people sort of bidding huge gas prices so that they can get their transaction in first before other people. And so actually it still happens, but up until very recently where changes were made to the fee market in Ethereum, it was this like just bidding war for gas. People could be spending 8 to 10 Ether for one transaction just in the fee alone to get their transaction picked up by miners who obviously prioritize higher gas price transactions because they get paid more. like Steve said, it's all about balancing incentives. And if I were to strip back all of the jargon, all of the technical stuff around blockchain and generally decentralized technologies, it's all about alignment of incentives. The user, the person who's contributing to the operation of the network, and really any other counterparty in this space needs to be incentivized to do what is the best for the network. And I say that in quotations because that's also subjective, right?
Yeah, what's best for the network is usually best for the owner of the network. Those two things are the same, right?
If you are both a user and owner of the network, that represents that alignment of incentives. Finding that sweet spot where what's best for the network is, in general, best for the owners, is also best for you as a user. And that's kind of what all of these blockchain networks are predicated on. And they're not perfect.
Yeah.
But I think they're predicated economically on that. You were saying like someone doesn't have a backup strategy in place.
Yeah.
Their node goes down. There are economic disincentives for poorly configured or otherwise faulty nodes, oftentimes in networks.
Right, which is a disincentive for the regular Joe to get into this world in the beginning. And like you were saying, like where generational change and technological knowledge will, of course, have an impact on this. And I totally agree with you. And I'm just playing the old guy, get off my lawn type of person because a lot I don't understand about this, but I also see a lot of potential fraud. And if you remember back to the first .com bubble, it was my first bubble, there was a lot of fraud. And all that shit eventually got exposed. But the people behind that fraud kept going in the industry, right? Like there were very few consequences. And so that's part of the thing I'm looking at now is like, okay, I have a lot more wisdom, I think, nowadays than I did back then 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So trying to be a little more careful, right? But still being pro technology and pro advancement. Sometimes I just sit back and wonder, like, what the hell problem are we trying to solve here? Because like the Robert Mondavi thing is a really good example. Like they're creating these bottles, almost 2,000 bottles that are unique bottles.
Yeah.
Why do you need a digital representation? You own the fucking bottle. Yeah. Like that makes no sense to me. Oh, this is the proof that I own this bottle for anyone that cares. It's like yet another way to peacock on Facebook. I don't understand. And I think it's just because, they're experimenting and it's the Wild West, right?
I think that's really what it is. There are a lot of examples in the NFT space in particular that you have less than ideal use cases. And I say use cases very loosely as well, like things that don't make sense, like that don't take advantage of what NFTs have to offer long term, or just have a lack of understanding about what people value about NFTs. And while they're cool to think about because it's an established brand or company playing in the space, it's also what do we really want to achieve and what value does this have for the owner of that? And if it's hard to say, if it's hard to point to, or if it's a stretch, maybe it wasn't the right move. And I think you're going to see, and you're already seeing it, brands that take a step into NFTs in a way that's very clearly like it's profit motive or marketing motive, and there's not a lot of value for the owner long term. They're starting to get dragged both by media who hates NFTs, but also by people who love NFTs and think that it's a cash grab. So we're starting to have that accountability, but I also agree we're going to have a .com bubble burst in this space. I don't know when that's going to be, but there are I don't even know now. I used to know the exact number of cryptocurrencies there are. Thousands of blockchains, thousands of cryptocurrencies, and thousands of products built on top. 98% of them are going to go away.
Yeah. Which worries me too about like digital wallets. Like what's that digital wallet? MetaMask. Yeah, that's the one that Robert Mondavi links to. Like this cracks me up. Robert Mondavi on their website is linking to a blog post on how to set up your digital wallet on some other random dude's site. It's like
crazy. It's crazy.
But anyways, Forrest, you're talking about the idea that a lot of this stuff is going to go away because there will be a culling of all the bad tech. Mm-hmm. And I'm excited about that because that's when the real work begins and that's when all the stable stuff starts to come out. But what happens to all these people that have their money or their NFTs in things like MetaMask? What happens if these companies go under? Like, what do I do as a consumer? Do I just basically have to kind of take it in the shins a little bit?
For utilities and tools like MetaMask, those things are, I guess, from the perspective of ongoing development and new features, and if there's a big change to the Ethereum network or broadly Ethereum virtual machine compatible networks out there, you're going to be missing the core dev team behind it, which is really now like kind of an open source community.
Yeah.
If they just go away, you're not immediately affected in the sense that there will be another wallet for you to go to. Or at worst case, you can go right back to the very brass tacks and you can set up your own wallet using the most primitive tools And there are plenty of tutorials to do that out there. I will personally help people if they'd like me to do that, if this ever happens. And then you can move all of your assets out of that MetaMask wallet and go about business as usual. But if protocols go away, let's say by some sort of regulatory challenge, some networks are more susceptible to regulatory challenge than others because they're actually less decentralized than they say they are. If a network goes away altogether, that's when people start to get hurt, because all of the tools and the assets and things that you have there rendered pretty useless if that were to happen. I don't know that we've actually seen that happen yet, where something has just ceased to exist. But we've seen people shift away from an adoption perspective. One example of this was EOS. There's a blockchain network. I think they raised via ICO like 4 billion. That's billion with a B.
Yeah.
And they had tons of capital and they built up a pretty good community. But very quickly, some of the decisions that were made clearly weren't the right ones. The network worked, but never really got off the ground. People left, and it's kind of a ghost town.
Yeah.
They're rebuilding now, but it's like there's no guarantees. If you had a bunch of EOS, you're like, what's going on? What do I have in return for this?
Yeah, that's tricky with especially with open source too. If like we bring open source into this, where does open source fit in the crypto world? Is most of this being done open source, or are there companies that are doing it proprietary as well, like creating proprietary networks?
From a protocol perspective, I would be willing to say it's dang near 100% open source, because that's what's demanded. It benefits you because if you are open sourcing everything, you're going to be able to have more community collaboration. Like a lot of the goals are, let's get a core team to build something and then get community members and people who want to invest their time and effort and get talented folks on board with the native token and like the skin in the game, just help build this and grow it. That's what they're trying to do. But beyond that, the trust factor is, if I can't see it, for a lot of the technical people in the space, if I can't see it and I can't independently verify to an extent, I'm not going to touch it.
Back to what are we really solving here? Like, are the major banks going to change their backend systems to be blockchain based when there's not really an advantage to that?
Well, I thought the advantage to that was that they could do things like international clearing instantaneously, as opposed to it taking a week or 2 weeks with the systems that exist today.
I mean, I think it's going to be, and I always try and be careful with this, because I don't want to come off as like anti-establishment or anti-bank, like, oh, well, the outcome is that all banks are abolished. I mean, that's just unrealistic. Okay. As much as we might like that, because our bank told us that they don't want us as a customer anymore, or they wouldn't send us checks, or they're not paying us interest, fine. Yeah. The thing is that I think it's just going to be a position where the market decides, the user base, the people decide now and have more power over what products are offered to them and how they're offered, rather than having an organization decide, right? So banks are rather going to just have to adjust the way that they operate, give people a little bit more sovereignty, give people a little bit more ability to dictate terms, if you will. And they may not like it, but I think that's just the way that it's trending. The value is making people owners as well as readers and writers in systems. So they're no longer just dictated terms. Here's how it is. If you don't like it, too bad. If you want to use it, use it. If you don't. And here, click the terms and conditions box.
Yeah. So it's basically like, here's another piece of data that we'll give you as a customer of our bank, because we're now running on the blockchain, but most people won't care.
Now there'll be more competition around yield, right? If you're a bank, you're building now maybe custody infrastructure for crypto assets. You're becoming an interface for decentralized finance. Your ability to just set terms unilaterally for your customers has sort of been eroded. And so the banks who, sort of take advantage of this and say, listen, we're going to give up some control and we're going to be very customer centric and user centric. I think those banks will still succeed. It's going to be the banks who say, we're not ceding control of this stuff and we're going to pay you 0.02% interest and you're going to like it, are the ones who are just going to fall into obscurity, because there'll just be better options now. And there are highly regulated entities now, we generally call like CFI, centralized finance, who are doing the same thing banks do, where they're taking effectively with crypto assets. They're taking crypto assets, they're lending to institutions, and they're generating yield. And they're passing that yield to customers, people like me or like you or whatever. And we were talking like for a USD pegged asset, like USDC, USD coin, it's a stable coin. You see like 9.5% APY with the same general risk profile as you would see in a fiat currency environment with a bank. Who's going to want to go to a bank and drop their savings in USD in a bank and earn nothing when they can earn 9.5%, understanding the risks of, potential belly up institutional lending environments?
Are you saying that you don't see the risk today, or eventually we'll get to the point where you can get 9% back as an example?
What I mean is that it's showing that the trend towards an environment where, yes, there is risk, and I'm not saying there's not. We're going to move into a space where in an environment where there are better options, no one's going to willingly and willfully go and say, okay, I'm just going to drop my money in a bank. I don't really care, whatever. Banks are going to have to come up with ways to be more equitable with their customers and be more generous with their customers, because there'll be other options that are really appealing.
Well, so in terms of shifting power back to the people, there's one more term that we haven't discussed, and that's a DAO, DAO, DAO. And this made the news recently. Some people tried to band together and buy a copy of the U.S. Constitution. Someone created a DAO for it, the Constitution DAO. They crowdfunded $47 million. In the end, they ended up losing because
you couldn't buy
people could see what they were bidding, right?
Yeah.
And they could just overbid them by $1. So tactically, they made some tactical mistakes, but look at the power of it. They raised $47 million very quickly. So tell us about what a DAO is, and I mean, will there be DAOs that act as banks like you're talking about, and users can essentially be investors in the bank? Or how's this, what is all this about?
What theoretically could happen and what will happen is something I could never speculate on in any probabilistically reasonable way, because I have no idea what's going to happen. There's a lot of moving parts in how DAOs will evolve. But a DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And it's basically taking the primitives that you get from these decentralized networks, namely, you are sort of an egalitarian or sovereign member of this decentralized community. You can, with your wallet and the subsequent private key and crypto assets that you have, build a stake in a decentralized organization. So you can facilitate, using a smart contract, voting systems to bring on, whether by reputation, whether by, it might be stake or skin in the game, whatever you want. You can build an organization where the sort of representatives, the decision makers, are elected in this decentralized community.
So this is a crypto analog of a corporation. I'm spinning up an LLC, and the people who get a token in this DAO by putting in a stake or whatever, they're like the shareholders, right?
In a sense, yeah. But now we're seeing, though, outside of just monetary value, like reputational value, or people who are thought leaders. Maybe it's people who, in a community, they have strategically been a voice in that space. They might be voted for by the rest of the community as a representative of this organization that doesn't have a single person with a gavel saying, okay, well, you're this, you're that, here's what we're going to do. It's moving away from the traditional like C-suite executive board model and moving towards one that's sort of a very active democratic process that's not limited to just a small set of people. Like anyone can take on a leadership role in that community, reputationally or otherwise. One great example that I always like to point to of like where DAOs could be going, there was an established organization. It was a formal corporate structure. They had accounting team, they had a PR team, they had all the trappings of a traditional company in the crypto space. They were called Shapeshift. They're still called Shapeshift. But Shapeshift has been gradually and has now transitioned from a corporate structure to a DAO. Now it's very focused on what the community wants to happen for that product or set of products in this company. So there's no single person to go to and say, hey, CEO, please speak on behalf of everyone. Tell us what's going to happen next. Moving from a small team making unilateral decisions to the community having a direct vote in what happens and where development resources are allocated. So you see these a company treasury denominated in cryptocurrency, and the community of users who uses that product basically voting directly on the next feature, the next functionality that gets built by this open source set of devs. And it's very, very interesting. Still immature. There are still areas where you're like, well, is this actually like an effective way to run, what was a company? The answer is in some ways yes, in other ways no. But that's mechanically what's happening. It's people trying to change what a company is becoming a DAO.
Yeah, Forrest, what you just mentioned about people voting, like that happens in open source all the time with GitHub, right?
Yeah.
Like I can vote with a PR or an issue,
Yeah.
whatever. I thought it was interesting. I just was Googling DAO earlier, and Wyoming is actually the first state to recognize a DAO as a legal entity,
Great point. Yeah.
and then happened in July, sorry. And it's this company called the American Crypto Fed DAO. And, now that they have legal entity recognition, like that changes how you interact with them from a legal perspective at the very least. And instead of everyone in a DAO having like equal liability, now it's an entity unto itself, and you're protected. And I think that's going to be a very necessary step along the way of getting DAOs to become a real thing. But then if it happens, you kind of like have to ask the question, well, how is that different than another organization? Sure,
Yeah.
the voting structures have all been solved before with like options and things like that, right?
Yeah. And it's going to be one of those things where we're always in this weird gray area between how things work today and how regulatory structures are, like even all the way down to like what's a security, right?
Yeah.
Applying securities rules to cryptocurrencies is very difficult. And that's why there's all this question about like what is a security? Or is this cryptocurrency security? If this one is and this one isn't, why?
Yeah, exactly.
Same thing with DAOs, and same thing with how intellectual property rights and DMCA and other things like other regulations apply to NFTs. It's like we are in such a maelstrom of gray area about how these things will develop and where standards land, that it's really fun, but equally very difficult to build in this space because you never know what's going to happen next.
Yeah. So how do you guys, like on you personally and your teams that you work with, like how do you prioritize your time and where to spend it? Because like you just said, there's so many things you could do. How do you decide what the most important things are to do now?
It's not easy. I think it's a balance of what functionality can be built now in such a way that it's easy enough to use for someone who's not so adept in this space, but also thinking about the long-term strategy you're kind of playing this like 4D chess game. It's like, if this regulatory move is made that's potentially plausible, where can we go next? And how can we protect ourselves and shield ourselves from liability in how we develop this? But I mean, I can say anecdotally, having worked with the open source crypto project, even like protocol developers for blockchains, the majority of money they spend is not on development. It's on lawyers and regulatory support.
Yeah.
Every move needs to be deliberated on all the way down to like the economics and how they talk about stuff. Because if you start talking about your token a certain way, it becomes scrutinized as a security, maybe more in a more likely way than if you say it this way.
All right. Well, I had originally wanted this to be a lightning round, and it took an hour and 20 minutes, which is fine.
That's literally that's all how it always goes.
Yeah. Let's wrap this up, and then we'll dive into the Web3 stuff. So I just wanted to make a couple of call outs. If you want to know more about DAOs, and I think this is a fascinating topic that I don't fully understand myself, Jason Calacanis, who's the host of the All In podcast, my favorite podcast, I think maybe Steve's favorite podcast or one of them as well. He has another podcast that he runs called This Week in Startups. And if you listen to episode 1324, he brought Aaron Wright from Open Law on to discuss DAOs, and they do a really deep dive into the legal aspects of it. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. The other thing I want to call out is if you want to know more about this space in general, the book Out of the Ether was a very fun read. And I like it. It basically ping-pongs around three different major storylines. A third of it is just biographical story about the creator of Ethereum, Vitalik. A third of it is about the creation of Ethereum and how they created it and all the people who were part of that project. And then the last third is about a famous Ethereum heist on the original DAO and how the community sort of fought back against that and what they did. So I think it's a really interesting read, and gives you a lot more insight into where this stuff comes from. So let's transition over into really talking about Web3 in particular, learning what Web3 really means, and giving Rhett a chance to answer some questions from the developer side of things. Forrest, in your mind, and I know this is an evolving concept, but what does Web3 mean to you?
Let's look at the trajectory of the web. Generally speaking, Web 1.0 was the read-only web. There was a very small group of people, like content publishers, often like the journalism space, who would publish content for people like you and me to consume. Web 2 was the shift towards services where it allowed for user created content, like user generated content. So it became like the read write web, where I can consume content that other people just like me have created. I can create my own content and share that with other people. That's social networks. That's like YouTube, which is kind of a social network in and of itself. That's Medium, where you can write your own blog posts, WordPress, all that jazz, right? Web 3 is generally...
Well, hold on. So I want to go beyond just those social networks. Web 2 is really, I mean, in my mind, the way I think about it was really the movement of applications off of our desktops and into some sort of centralized hosting provider, whether that's a social network like Facebook or something like that, Twitter, etc., or just regular applications like moving Photoshop into the cloud or moving email clients into the cloud. Right? That's all Web 2 as well, right?
Yeah. The commoditization of like web services and apps is like the final frontier of Web 2. So yeah, I totally agree with you, Chad. And then Web 3, and I think people have gleaned this from the conversation we had, which was like the long thunderstorm rather than lightning round. It's the shift from that read and write to being an owner as well. So as a user, I am a consumer, but I'm also an owner. And there's multiple ways that manifests. That could be in the governance of the thing that I'm using. So like the future development and how that product is used and actively grown. That could be also financial in nature. The success of said product, I might have skin in the game, even if it's a small amount. If that service or that product or that protocol does well, I also do well. And so it's that shift that we were talking about before of terms being dictated to users by single or maybe even just a group of centralized entities to a very predominantly peer-to-peer decentralized methodology for the web and the services therein. Like that would be the simplest way I could describe the transition to Web 3.
Yeah, I'm looking at the Web3 Foundation's website.
Yeah, good place to start.
Well, they actually have a technology stack like L0, L1, L2. It's interesting. There's a lot of words in here that I, of course, recognize having been in this world for a while. And so to me, it's kind of like, okay, what exactly are we trying to build here other than just a bunch of new infrastructure that we call distributed when I've been dealing in distributed systems for a decade, right? Like
that. Now that is a great point.
The old man in me that's like, get off my lawn. You know, you call this distributed. I've been dealing with distributed for a long time. So it can't be about just that, right? I like your point about the ownership aspect, even though I don't really think about it like that. I probably need to evolve my thinking because I just like, who really cares if I own a piece of what I'm surfing, like a piece of the technology that I'm using to get a job done? I bought it. Does that mean that I own a part of it? If I buy an Apple iPhone, does that mean I own part of the Apple experience for the person next to me? I don't know how that works.
And if you buy Apple stock, does that make you an owner?
Does it make you an owner? Yes, but you're not. That doesn't really render you a whole lot of power over the products that Apple offers you. I don't even know if Apple, like I could use Apple as an example, but I think a better example would be a recent topical example of why Web3 potentially matters, right? Why people are appealed to this idea where you're not a second-class citizen anymore. You're not beholden to one single organization's view of the world. So like, for example, Facebook, now Meta, we know the big transition to the metaverse, which is a whole nother podcast in and of itself, which maybe you guys could make. What happened was and people may have seen this story, but there was a creator who had the handle on Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, now Meta, Metaverse. So she has this handle. She's been creating content there for 10 years. This is the crux of this person's sort of creative life, what makes their living. In this transition to Meta, Facebook/Instagram/Meta revokes that handle. All the content that's created there, gone. There's no question. There's no recourse because you check the box. The terms and conditions you want to create here, we can take it away from you at any time without warning. And that's the danger. And that's why people are trying to think about ways we can move to non-revocable content, a place where there is a degree of censorship resistance. That's a double-edged sword, I will say very clearly. Moving to a place where you actually own the things that you are creating. Someone else can't unilaterally decide to just take it away from you or remove your right to it. I think that's really what it's about, more so than buying a piece of software and saying, hey, I own a license to this so that I can use it. But even in those terms, if Adobe doesn't like the way that you're using their software or changes their terms of where they offer that service, even if you bought it, they can take it from you. And so it's really, how can we build systems where the user is almost on equal playing field with the creator of a given service? And I know that there's always this concern, right? Like, well, let's think about a future where you have content creation where there is no central moderator. We've all probably seen the type of crazy stuff on any side of whatever political, socioeconomic, or other deeply held conviction. There are some crazy people out there that create crazy stuff, that say really terrible stuff. So I don't think this is advocating for just a free for all where you create whatever you want and there's no consequences. It's rather, let's create an ecosystem where you are responsible and accountable for what you create, and the community decides as a whole what is okay and what's not. Because I actually feel like people are pretty good at knowing what as a whole is right and wrong. And we've sort of now depend today on content moderation by one single entity who decides where the lines are. But I think people are pretty good at doing that if given the tools and given the chance to self-moderate as a community. And if you have a large community where it's a really large mix of people, you start to normalize and set those lines as a community, like what's too far, what should not be allowed to live here as a piece of content.
So has anybody created a Web3 version of something like Twitter or Reddit or something like that where the community collectively decides what to censor?
Yes, there are examples of it, although I will say, and I don't want to make this into a political podcast because it really isn't, but what are the communities right now that are being quote unquote deplatformed and censored on social media? It's generally, maybe you could argue there's like extreme, what in the US would be deemed left wing, but it's mostly right wing oriented content that's being removed from platform.
Well, but even setting that aside, there's like, think about subreddits that get banned, right? Whether it's...
Yeah, well, like Wall Street, like some of the investing ones.
Well, there's investing ones, but also people posting like the guy who live streamed, him like going into a mosque and shooting people. Like if the community wants to delete that content, maybe they want to vote on it. This is not a political decision. It's just like what's appropriate.
My point is that the people who are being banned from what's there now are the ones who are flocking to these alternatives where there's community moderation. So you have this, my point was more so not that it's like this one community or another, but it's those who create what is undesirable on current platforms are the ones who are going to the alternatives. So there's not really a lot of moderation going on these platforms because it's sort of an echo chamber, or it's really a lot of the same types of content that are there. So I don't think this community moderation works unless these are the standard places where people create content and moderate content, I think is the main point. So there's not a good example of this working, community moderation working right now, because there's not enough of a diverse community creating content and using these services yet, because I think a lot of people don't mind using the platforms they have now. We're not quite to the point where people hate the services enough to leave. We're getting there, I think, but not yet.
I wonder, because Reddit's about to IPO, and I wonder if how that'll affect people who use that site.
I think people follow creators, right? Like I remember when my wife first got into podcasts a few years ago, she started listening to all these true crime podcasts. And then next thing you know, she's paying money into a Patreon for her favorite creators. And I was like, how the hell do you know about Patreon? She's like, well, these people that I follow their podcasts, they use a Patreon, and so I'm paying to get access to the, the bonus content. And I thought that was hilarious because I had heard of Patreon, of course, as a technologist, but I'd never used it. And then to find out she's paying into it and just like, oh yeah, obviously, Steve, this is how it works, and she's not a technologist. I just thought that was funny. The creators are the ones I think they're going to drive this change, because I, as a YouTube consumer, don't give a shit if you're on YouTube or some other platform. The content is what I want. So if I like you and you tell me that you're going to go to another service, I'll follow you. I mean, look at Joe Rogan. How many people are moving over to Spotify because of him when he gets off of YouTube, right?
Yeah.
It's a really good example of a famous creator that's making a decision that influences where people go to consume their content. Now, Spotify does not have as far as I know, like a contract with their users that says, here's all the laws that we abide by other than the T's and C's, which no one reads. They could probably do something that I, as a consumer, would hate, but it's likely going to hit the Joe Rogans of the world before it will hit me. And it'll just keep following where they go. So I think that will actually be what happens to make these platforms more popular, is the creators will just say, screw it, I need more control over my own destiny. And so I'm going to go to this other platform.
It's difficult on YouTube now to have healthy, non-toxic discussion about controversial issue because you're immediately demonetized. If you rely on that income, that's a problem for you. If you're really not doing anything wrong for all intents and purposes, you're kind of treated as a problem. And I think that that's something that's frustrating for a lot of people who really just want to create healthy discussion around something.
I do think that part of Web3 will be very popular just because I want more organic, authentic content. And, now seeing kind of through the veil of the fake media and all that stuff and their incentives.
Yes.
It's fairly easy for me to see a world where the creators band together and form their own kind of networks, their own constitutions, if you will.
Yes.
And then assuming that they have technology capability, they can then go run it. That I think the next challenge comes, where do they run it?
So let's talk about the tech for Web3, because I think that's where we're going here. So when in Web2, when I spin up an application, I run my app somewhere. Maybe it's in a cloud provider, maybe it's on my own server, but it's centralized and people talk to it over the web. If I want to create a Web3 application, or I think a DApp or distributed application, how do I do that? Where do I host my stuff? Where does it work? Do people need a special browser to access it? Are they invoking REST APIs like they are on Web 2.0? Like what are all the pieces in the glue?
So I would say there's a lot of variability in how these things practically have been created. Say, let's go to like the fundamental like Web3 stack. You're looking at a decentralized network like a blockchain being one of like the major functional layer, right? That's where a certain set of data is stored. That's where you have the identity foundations. You've got your wallet, right? You have smart contracts that serve as business logic. And then you have atop that an interface place, right? Where you have maybe one option, like we talked about with the DEXs before, where you have a web interface that might be a statically hosted React application. And the blockchain itself exposes these APIs for the functional layers, right? Of what these smart contracts do and how you interact with it. So you create your own client. You can interact with it directly with the smart contract programmatically if you'd like.
Will the blockchain be my only database? So like I won't have any need for MySQL or DynamoDB anymore. How does that all fit in?
That's where you start to see amalgamations or deviations from a like purely, and I know Steve pulled up like the Web3 stack, like the layer 0 up the stack. There are now instances where you see Web3 companies basically running some traditional technology, off-chain data storage. They might be running analytics dashboards so that if you're using DeFi, you can see like total usage information about what's going on, what the transaction load is, what assets are being traded right now. So you have these applications that might be pretty traditional in nature, using serverless stacks of the world to create experiences for the end user. But I think ultimately at the base level, the ability for someone who doesn't want to use all that stuff to kind of roll their own and build their own. And a true like Web3 type of website you will go to this potentially to an interface. You will connect your wallet that might be MetaMask. You might have a mobile wallet like Rainbow Wallet in the Ethereum space using Wallet Connect interface. And you'll be able to interact with that. And all the like profile information and your own data stays with you, right? You own your profile data and all of the assets and things that you're using that application with.
So it's in your wallet. It's not in the blockchain.
Exactly. You own the identity attributes and the data and the things that you are going to be using while you interact with that application to the greatest extent possible. The discussion of like what's on chain versus what's off chain, whether that's owned by a product company or that's owned by you, it's really a design consideration. What can you put on the blockchain without introducing excess costs or excess pain, like wait time for your end user?
Is that sense of ownership more cultural or technological? Because even at the like profile data level, there's nothing that stops that service from right-clicking your profile data and then now they are building up their own database of every user who's interacted with their service, right? So though the original version is on your phone, you can authenticate it via the blockchain. It's not like a digital rights management platform by any means. Like,
I think there's a cultural element to it, but I also think that because of that diversity of client and the ability for you to decide how you interact with it, if you were to find a client application that was scraping data that is otherwise local in your browser and putting it through some opaque API that you don't recognize, the idea is that you have the freedom and the ability to now choose another client to interact with that service, the functional parts of that service in a completely different way. And I think that's really what it is. And there is always a trust dynamic when you're interacting with an interface. And that's what a lot of people point to is the interface. If you can't trust the interface, then what are you really achieving? And it's a great point. But I think it's that you can choose what interface you use and you will naturally find the most trustworthy alignment with your beliefs and your values.
Well, Forrest, that whole thing you just said assumes that I'm going to read the EULA. And I don't read the EULAs. Right?
Yeah. Well, the other thing too is it is dependent on people knowing how things work in some ways. I need to know like how to check. When something's not working on a web page, my first thought is I'm going to the dev tools. I want to see what's going on. Is there a request that's failing? Is there some error that can tell me what's going on here? I think the average user is I'm going to open a support ticket or I'm going to rage quit it. But part of that also goes to the design of the product itself. How can you build it so that there's limited necessity for you to collect information in the first place? Like when I go on a decentralized exchange, the only thing it really needs is the ability to read my wallet to see what assets I have, so it can compile a transaction that I can then check, approve, and sign, and that's it. I'm completely pseudonymous to this DEX. So even if they wanted to take my address and the assets I have and the trade I made, they can already find that on the blockchain. So it really doesn't matter. There's no incentive for them to grab information.
Before, so many companies right now are making money selling my data.
Agreed.
What's going to happen to these companies when now all of a sudden I have control over what they can see, but only to a certain extent, right? Like I'm still using their service.
Yeah.
So they can still see where I'm going on the site and what I'm doing, and they can monetize that.
They're going to have to start selling their value to you and make you a customer again. Whereas now it's kind of like if some sites it's like some services are incentivized to give you as much free stuff as possible that may or may not be that valuable at the end of the day to get you to give them certain information that they can then sell. And I mean, I already think that there's enough community pressure against some of the big companies like Facebook and Google, et cetera, to like back away from that a little bit, because you're seeing like changes to the way that they manage data, what you can opt out of and what level of control you have. So I think it's clear we're trending in that direction. People want that control, but they'll gladly be your customer. If you provide them value, they'll pay for it.
I think that's not actually accurate if you ask the average person. Like if you walk into a coffee shop and ask them if they were able to use a Facebook that did not sell their information, they pay $5 a year for the privilege. And I've asked this to a number of my family members down here in Arizona. And the answer every single time was no, I wouldn't. It's not worth the $5 a year.
Then they're not providing enough value.
When I can just trade my data. But I think it's a misunderstanding of how much my data is worth, how much my transaction history through the internet is worth to an organization, and not understanding that you're actually you are the product.
Yeah.
So if the average user doesn't understand that, how do you get them, number one, to understand that, number two, to care, and then number three, to take action? Because there has to be pain or pleasure.
But also you should ask, are they wrong?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, I don't know. I don't know if they're wrong.
Yeah. And I don't believe that this will be a ubiquitous way of thinking. And I can't say definitively if this shift will happen, but I'm starting to see more people caring about this and starting to be alarmed by the way that data is collected and how you're marketed to in like a very scary way. It's really hard to say. And I agree, Steve, by no means do I think everyone feels this way. And there are a lot of people who frankly don't care, right? And that's perfectly fine. But I think there's a larger and larger population of people who are starting to realize the next thing is going to be taking action, which is a much bigger lift.
The traditional, I think, Web 2 hello world type application, like you look at the classic DHH Ruby on Rails, how do you build a blog in 15 minutes or whatever. I haven't seen one for a Web3 application that is kind of the same caliber of like, what is the de facto application for a Web3 stack? But I've heard the like, oh, what's the Web3 killer application? Imagine an Uber without a middleman. You can just go direct to the driver. Or imagine Airbnb where you don't have to pay the 20% convenience fee or whatever. But one of the problems for me, at least, for all those examples has been like, and maybe this is my bias from having a wife that's run customer service teams and trust and safety and companies like this, to where like you're not paying for the transactions, you're paying for the customer service, and you're paying for that trust that middleman is providing so that you can actually enter this market. But what happens when I show up at my Airbnb and it's just an empty lot? And by the way, I threw up in the back of the Uber on the way there, but I don't know. I don't care. So let's just move on. What's the actual application for the Web3 stack that we could wrap our minds around?
A great example of this would be in the financial services space and what we're seeing in DeFi, right? Where your ticket to entry does not involve someone approving you to participate in this potential transaction opportunity. By that hand, you take full responsibility for a mistake. If you make a mistake and you sign a transaction that you don't understand and you lose money, that's on you and that's not on the bank.
What about applications that aren't DeFi related? I mean, will people be creating the Uber with no middleman on Web3 or the Airbnb with no middleman on Web3?
Probably. It's possible to do that now. And I think there's a reason why you haven't seen things like that take off, because people, quite frankly, are not motivated enough by the issues that are inherently involved in Uber and Lyft to the point where they would go and try something else. And so to Rhett's point, okay, there's not really customer service. Oh, great. If there's a reputation-based system, well, there's a reputation-based system in Uber as well. Does that work really all that well? Is it easy to game that system? Yeah. So I think those examples are great in the sense that they illustrate the potential value of Web3, but in practice, one of two things. It's either the world is not ready for that type of thing, there's not enough motivation to move in that direction, or the technology is not mature enough to make it viable for mainstream use.
If it's limited to just trading various cryptocurrencies from one to another, or these sort of DeFi types of protocols, then it's never going to be mainstream, right? If I can't replace, why should anybody care about it if they can't replace Uber with this thing, or Twitter with this thing, or the things that we use every day with this new technology? If it's not going to be the basis of that, why is anybody going to care about it?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that you can't. I'm saying that right now it hasn't happened for a reason. The biggest thing, here's a great example, one that resonates to me the most. I'm a very privacy-centric guy. Right now, my identity is broken into a bunch of tiny little pieces, and some of those tiny little pieces that I have very little control over can be used to uproot and shake up my entire world, financially, reputationally, in many different ways. And by design, a lot of these things are just printed on paper. And I go to the doctor's office, they want my social security number, what have you. If I go to a bar and all I need to do at that bar is I need to prove that I'm over 21 to drink, the person who checks my ID also has my home address, a bunch of other demographic data, all sorts of other stuff about me because they get the ID card with all this other stuff printed on it. There's no selectivity. I don't really have ownership of this stuff because the actual storage and issuance of these identity attributes are managed by somebody else. And so ultimately, I think Web3, from my perspective, one of the killer applications is the unification of your financial world and the identity attributes and some of the usage of other utilities that could be the Ubers and it could be the social medias of the world in the future. It's the unification of that down to one primitive, and that's your wallet or your on-chain identity. So I have my one single source of control. Like I'm the pivot point now for all the things that I do and that I work with throughout the day. And so in practice, digital identity gives me the ability to take back full control over identity attributes. If I need to prove to you that I'm over 21, I don't need to give you my birthday. I just need to give you a proof. The DMV attests to a fact, which is that I'm over 21. Or if I need to, let's just say, prove that I got a degree from this university who's issued me this digital credential, I can do so in an instant with the signed proof. I don't need to fax you a piece of paper or get you a signed letter with a stamp on it from my university that takes 2 weeks and costs me $45. Like those are the things that I think are going to shift in this space. And again, it all boils back down to ownership. Like I'm the one, I own my data and I am in sole control over how I selectively share that data.
I think just to Steve's point, it's clear like most people don't care about their privacy of their data that much. If they did, Facebook and Twitter and all these, Google wouldn't exist.
The question that you asked initially, though, I don't think it's a totally fair question, because you're saying like, of all the tools and services that we use today, how is it going to change those? Well, I didn't use Twitter back when Web 2.0 was in its inception. There was no such thing, right? Like all these new things I have access to because of Web 2.0 were not things before it. So I think it's a challenge for me, I'll speak just for myself, to imagine a world where Web 3.0 is empowering things. But Forrest, based on what you just said, it feels to me like Web 3.0 large in part is like giving us an identity, a digital representation of ourselves, and an API for companies to interact with us, not just the other way around. Web 2.0 was all about their API. Web 3.0 is all about my API, potentially.
Yeah. And I mean, you can boil it down to that, where you become the focal point and the one who has that level of control. Like I can now dictate a terms of service for me as a user or a customer. What I deem to be enough value to share my data might be here.
Yeah.
And for someone else, it might be here. It's like, if you just let me convert this PNG to an SVG, I will give you my data, but for me, it's like, you need to, pay me $1,000. I mean, I'm making up an arbitrary example, but I think that's the beauty of it, is that it's not just isolated to people who really care about privacy. It's just letting you decide what that threshold is and not letting other people decide for you, I think is really how I would describe it. And if you don't care, your life's not going to change very much.
So Jack Dorsey recently had this spicy take where he came out after he quit Twitter. He basically went nuts on Twitter and started saying the VCs really own Web3 and just like they own Web2, right? All of the major companies, whether it's Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., were funded and mostly owned now by billionaires who bought in the first place. So do you agree with this take? I know that there's been a lot of disagreement about it online.
Not unilaterally. I think that this is true in isolation, but not true as a generalization. Like I think this is a really gross overgeneralization of what is going on in the space, because it's not just about like, just because VCs are present in something does not mean it's bad. And I think that's the danger. I've talked about this, sort of in my own personal interactions with people, but look at Jack's main focus right now, which is what was once Square, which is now Block. It's all predicated on Bitcoin. You see the Bitcoin thing in the picture behind him. I love Bitcoin. It's a huge proportion of my investment capacity in the world, right? But let's not pretend like there's not an incentive for him to discount Web3 and focus squarely the value on Bitcoin, which his main company and main goal right now is focused at Block. So it's like thinking about it from the perspective of why you would say something like that. I don't disagree on principle that there are plenty of examples of companies that I think they're basically just Web 2 companies, or whatever you want to call them, with VC influence that say they're Web 3 that really aren't. But that's not a general statement. That's true across the board.
But so what's he really saying here? He's saying that these new blockchains that are spinning up to compete against Bitcoin and Ethereum are primarily staked by VCs, and so they have control over what happens. Is that what he's talking about?
I interpret what he's saying in context of other things that he said before and after this, that every other example of blockchain and decentralized technology and like Web3 as this like product, or Web3 as a shift, is nonsense. And it's all just the same thing under a different name, owned by VCs, and you have no power, you have no control, and you don't own anything. Bitcoin is the only thing that matters, is really what he's saying here. And that includes Ethereum. Like, it's pretty clear that Jack Dorsey doesn't like Ethereum, nor anything on it. And I think that that's really where it becomes clear there's a lack of objectivity here. While in some cases what he's saying is true about some products and services, and we need more discernment for what is genuinely following the values of Web3 and what's not. Bitcoin is not the only thing, and I think that that's my main take. He's saying that Bitcoin is the golden child, and that's all that matters, and that's really all that we need, and I don't agree with that.
I see. He's a maximalist.
Right. Just in a less aggressive way, or less direct way. This is a pretty aggressive statement.
Well, maybe we wrap this up with a demo. What do you have to show us today?
Rhett, you were talking about like the hello world of Web3. The hello world of Web3 to me is to take web content, like a personal portfolio website or something like that, deploying that on a peer-to-peer file storage system. I like IPFS. So putting that onto IPFS and then facilitating the routing to that content via blockchain-based DNS sort of platform. And so I can show you some examples of what that looks like.
I have not seen any such thing, so that'd be great.
The hello world, if you will, for like Web3, for anyone who wants to try it out, there's some really like easy abstracted ways to do this without having to have much technical knowledge. But basically it's deploying like a personal website to IPFS, Interplanetary File System, which is a decentralized network for file hosting. So you can use that as an alternative to something like Amazon S3 or having your own server with a file system. You basically have a peer-to-peer network where you are storing files, and you can, of course, request those files, so you can host a website there. One abstracted service, if you don't want to fumble around with this and do IPFS related activities with your own IPFS node and doing this programmatically, there's a service called Pinata, which is fantastic. They've sort of now branded themselves as like a home for NFT media, right? So durable storage for you to store your, put your NFTs out there. Pinata is great. It's a great service. I use it fairly often. I created this little test account to show this to you. I basically took a really simple React application, like we're talking create React app, and I put like a little custom message on there, spinny atom thing. And I basically uploaded the build files, so the output of the build process for this React application, and deployed it to IPFS using Pinata.
So this is just all the static resources, HTML, CSS, etc., JavaScript.
Exactly. Yeah, static content. The only thing you really need to know about this is you need to use relative linking for all the components inside of your application. So this is really simple. You'll see the CIDs, the content ID, and I don't want to dive like incredibly deeply into like all the inner mechanics of IPFS, but the brass tacks is that it basically chunks your files up into like 256 kilobyte pieces, and it uses a Merkle DAG structure to assign a hash value, like a unique identifier or a CID, a content ID for each chunk of that file. So let's say you have an image and that image gets chunked up into like 8 pieces. You have this Merkle tree structure with the children, the leaves, the nodes, all the way up to this sort of parent object. So the parent here is the total cumulative web page, and underneath that, you'll have each of the objects underneath that, and they're chunked up structure. The searching for this file is done with a distributed hash table. So you basically search for content. So it uses content addressing instead of location addressing, which you have in like modern like web stuff, where you have a file path that ends up, rationalizing down to an IP address and a file system path. So that's basically at a very high level how IPFS works, very oversimplified. But here you can see the way that this is addressed here. There's an interface from Pinata. So you're interfacing through their IPFS abstraction, but you'll see the content ID here, the CID for this static web page is listed up here. And so this is a web page that is hosted on IPFS right now. If you want to take this a step further, there's a platform called Unstoppable Domains. They basically have deployed a smart contract based DNS system, if you will, where you can map. And these are actually NFTs, each of these domains. And so you can do like, look for a domain here, forest.x or forest.crypto, and all the resolution of these things happens on chain. And you can map to these domains. Basically, you can go in here and you can link a website IPFS hash to this domain. So when someone puts that domain in their browser, that's enabled to resolve these .crypto, .nft, .dao, .x domains, basically maps from the blockchain your domain to the IPFS hash for where that content lives. So I use Brave browser. This has native capacity to do that. So I can show you an example of a a website here. So I'll do this again so you can I can show you it's not smoke and mirrors. So I do vault74.crypto, which is one of those .crypto domains I showed you. This is reaching to the Ethereum blockchain, getting the IPFS hash of this content here for Vault74, which is like a chat and voice video streaming site or application. Pulls that content from IPFS, and you can go ahead and use it. And then if you want to try the actual service, they have like an application here, and you'll look. This is the way that MetaMask presents, right? So this is my wallet, and I need to have this wallet in order to start using this service. So this is an application where you have smart contracts on the blockchain, which serve a lot of functions. And you also have like sort of a broader technology stack around peer-to-peer streaming audio and video using this Vault74 application. I'm pretty sure Vault74 sets up end-to-end encryption using the foundational wallet technology that you have there, which is your MetaMask wallet with the private key. I don't know as much about the way that Vault74 is set up in this alpha product, but it's a great example of a piece of content that's routed via a domain that lives on the blockchain and then services built upon Web3.
So if you did an NS lookup on vault74.crypto, you wouldn't see anything because all the resolution happens through some other DNS network.
Right. So basically you're taking the smart contract itself, which keeps a mapping of this name, vault74.crypto, to a piece of content, which in this case is an IPFS hash. And so an IPFS hash here, I don't know if there's a way that I can show you what that IPFS hash looks like in this browser because it resolves them for you now. But it would look something like this, which is through an IPFS node that you have locally or through a public interface. So dweb.link is like a sort of a public resolver for IPFS. And so here's like an identifier for this piece of content. So yeah, that's generally what I would call this the hello world, right? You want to deploy static web content to IPFS, and you want to route to that content using a domain that's resolved on the blockchain in totality. So this is like very limited. Like you don't need a bunch of extra stuff to show how this works. And across the gamut here, you've got decentralized storage at the base, and the domain resolution is also not controlled by a centralized server or entity. This website you have control over. You're not going to get deplatformed, I suppose, with this type of construct. Obviously, very simple, not very useful for in this example, but you get the idea.
So anyone could write a client that updates essentially their DNS records on the blockchain, replacing unstoppabledomains.com, right?
So
they
there's
could write
this
their own.
Exactly. There's this like nice little interface here, which you can use, which is great for the average user, right? So you can use this domain as well to map different addresses that you own,
right?
So that you can, in wallet applications, instead of copying and pasting these ugly hashes, you can type the domain.crypto, domain.dao, and it maps the address. But yeah, diversity of client still applies here. This is just an abstraction that Unstoppable Domains is provided to let you access the functionality from a user interface, but they've got tools that you can use to build your own, or you can just look at their contracts and build your own interface yourself. So pretty flexible.
So React applications are typically turning around and calling REST APIs that live on some server somewhere. So is that they're going to turn around and call smart contracts instead? Or would we still have REST APIs somewhere in the mix?
It depends on the service, but I think the traditional DApp model or decentralized application model is like a React application that directly interfaces with the blockchain, and all the transactions are signed using your user-owned wallet. That's the pattern. Is
who pays the gas fee then every time I click something in your React app?
In that case, user pays gas fees. There are some applications where they will have set it up so that there's like sort of service paid gas fees. So like, for example, Unstoppable Domains, if you use their interface and you're using, in this case, they have also a Polygon integration. So if you deploy your DNS record to Polygon, or you mint your NFT on Polygon, they'll pay the fees for you if you use their interface. You can choose not to, but there is an option there. So some platforms will give you an option. Like if you're using a DEX, for example, like if I go to like Uniswap app.uniswap.org. Always check your URLs. I go ahead and connect my wallet here, and I'm paying all the fees, right? It's like if I were to issue a transaction here, I would be signing a transaction from this wallet that I connected to make my swap. So it's usually user pays the fees. This is really just a conduit, an abstraction.
Is there some sort of site that shows all the equivalents? Okay, normally I would do Route 53. Instead, I'm going to use this thing for DNS. I put my static files in S3. Now I put them in IPFS. But there's a bunch of plumbing in there beyond that, right? What's these are all new sites. I've never heard of any of these services. Pinata, I've never heard of Polygon. I don't even know what that is. You were just showing.
Gotcha. Yeah. So there's not a lot of really great unified utilities to do introspection here. With IPFS, for example, if you want to grab a piece of content, there's sort of an internal, there's that CID naming service. It's content addressing. So you're looking for a specific piece of content, which is a little tricky because if you don't know about the content first, it's you don't know what you don't know. So there are some abstractions there around how do you figure out what you're looking for. In these cases, if you have a site or an application, that's why these domains are valuable, because whoever built the interface can put a human readable name in front of that content ID and serve you up that content. I would say the only thing that I will say is when you're looking at where stuff is, you want to know what the contract addresses are for a given service. You want to know where the official interfaces are or where the tools are to build your own or whatever, or documentation. You would want to go to the main page for the application or service. Most of them will have one, and they'll tell you what their smart contracts do, generally how they work, where they're deployed, if you'd like to interact with them. And that would be the best place to start, is the docs for each of these platforms.
This is fascinating. This is just fascinating.
There are parallels, but a lot of it is very new and very, very interesting. I mean, IPFS in and of itself is a whole area of study. It uses a lot of traditional data structures in a pretty cool way. Actually, funny enough, Rhett, IPFS, I don't know if you're super familiar with it, but it really works similarly to the approach around Git, right? Git really is dependent on these DAG structures. That's what IPFS works with a lot. And it uses it in a file system abstraction.
Where is the the split between these applications and a traditional web browser and extensions that you need to install to make certain things work? What works with the traditional stack transparently for the user and what requires bonus local applications?
Yeah. So what I just showed, a web page hosted using IPFS and routed using a domain, the only thing you need to resolve that as a user or a person who's casually browsing is a browser that supports IPFS and or this DNS resolution. So in that case, if you're deployed on IPFS, you have a website there. A lot of browsers now are integrating the capability to resolve IPFS content by content ID, that's CID. A few browsers like Brave and Opera also have support for resolving blockchain-based domains, unstoppable domains, for example. So that would be something where it just works natively, right? And a lot of people use Brave and even more people use Opera. So it's becoming a little bit more commonplace to have this built in. But there are also now extensions for all Chromium-based browsers. And I think Firefox also has extensions to resolve IPFS content and to resolve blockchain-based domains. So in that case, yeah, you could get a browser extension to facilitate that for you pretty easily. The only other thing is if you're trying to create content or you're trying to publish something, you will need a wallet as well to pay your fees if you need to make a DNS record on the blockchain, for example.
Is all of this going to replace what people were doing for the last 10 years or maybe longer on Tor, where they had these illicit sites, whether that was the Silk
dark
Road,
web.
the dark
web,
dark
yeah.
web. Well, you had DPR, Dread Pirate Roberts was running Silk Road. He got busted. But is all that stuff from Tor going to move into this sort of IPFS Web3 anonymous world? Or maybe it's already happened? I don't know.
It very well could. I mean, I think it's hard to say definitively if the technology that exists now as a means to an end to achieve the vision of Web3 is what will be here and what will end up being adopted, right? There are issues with IPFS, for example. if you publish a file to IPFS and it's, chunks are propagated around, different peers have pieces of that file in like a cache, these nodes will sometimes clear their cache. And if the file's not being requested, it can just go away, right? So there's like not a lot of just native durability. So you need services like Pinata, which sort of pin content to make sure it's in, it's peered and it's in the cache and it's ready to be requested. So like some of these things, maturity has to come before it becomes viable for like a mainstream web application. Like DeFi is pretty popular, but not that many people use it yet. It's not a Facebook or a Dropbox or a Google Drive or Gmail. Like it's still very small space, and not everyone that's deploying interfaces for DeFi is even using IPFS. They're still using traditional methods for hosting a web page. The answer is, to your question, the answer is maybe, but I would say I think we're not yet at the point where all the primitives are there to make this stuff a reality in totality.
Good. Well, it's an evolving thing. I think it's time to wrap it up here.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Steve had to run off to another meeting, so I'm gonna wrap it up. Rhett, thanks for joining us today as our first bestie guestie host. Forrest, this has been a fascinating episode. It's going to drop. It won't drop until 2022, maybe in January or February. But I hope everybody has a happy new year, and I hope you enjoyed this. Look, this podcast is spreading by word of mouth. If you guys like this episode, please just tell your friends about it. Share it on LinkedIn. It's probably where most people hear about it. And we appreciate helping us get the word out. So thanks very much, and I hope everybody has a happy new year.
Amazing. Thanks. Cheers.
Thank you.